catch me howling at the moon.
What's up guys, and welcome back to Park Pros. This past July, I made my first trip back to Kings Island in Mason, Ohio for the first time since 2012. And one of the most pleasant surprises of my entire trip was how good my rides were on the park's B&M Hypercoaster, Diamondback. When I first rode Diamondback in 2012, I loved this ride and it instantly cracked my top 5 overall coasters. Almost a decade later, I went into my 2020 trip with the expectation that it would still be a fun hyper, but nothing too special, and I was pleasantly surprised with how well this coaster held up. Now granted, I've ridden hundreds of new coasters since 2012, so Diamondback has fallen off my rankings quite a bit. But even then, I think I'm still pretty high on Diamondback compared to most people. And with this video coming out right after I spent last week dissing the Morgan Hypercoasters, I'm expecting the comment section to be just as heated, because I know there's a good amount of people out there that do not think Diamondback is a very good ride. But go ahead and roast my coaster takes as much as you want, I'm completely here for it. In this video, I'll give you my review of Diamondback at Kings Island, a coaster that, in my opinion, still outshines the park's brand new B&M Giga coaster, Orion. We'll talk about all that and more, but first, if you guys are new to the channel or have been checking out some of the other videos lately, be sure to subscribe because it really does help us out a ton.
There's only one place where you can feel like a king, Kings Island. Come be king of the hill and feel your heart race.
In the first 30 years of Kings Island's history, the park had firmly established itself as the wooden coaster capital of the world. Starting with the Racer in 1972, followed by the world's longest wooden coaster, the Beast, 7 years later in 1979, and capped off with the world's only ever wooden hypercoaster, Son of Beast, in 2000. But heading into the 2000s, the park shifted focus to expanding their steel coaster portfolio, starting with the additions of Flying Ace Aerial Chase and Backlot Stunt Coaster by Paramount Parks in 2001 and 2005 respectively. The Cedar Fair era of the park also started with a steel coaster, with the relocation of Firehawk to the park in 2007. But throughout this decade, one question hung over Kings Island. When would they finally be getting the big one, aka a Hyper or Giga, to shore up the coaster lineup of the rapidly expanding park? That question was answered on August 6, 2008, when Kings Island announced that they would be adding the biggest investment in park history for 2009 in the form of Diamondback, a $22 million hypercoaster from B&M. Diamondback would open to the public on April 18, 2009 as Kings Island's tallest and fastest roller coaster. I got back to Kings Island for a handful of Diamondback rides this year. Here are my complete thoughts on the ride.
Kings Island's tallest, fastest, meanest coaster ever. Acres of snake-backed track coiled around the clouds.
Let's start as we always do by running through Diamondback's 5,282 feet of track. You climb up the ride's 230-foot lift hill and descend down a 215-foot first drop. After taking a slight right, you head up into a 193-foot camelback hill, followed by a slight turn to the left and a 131-foot hill. Now before we continue, let me just say that Diamondback has some pretty good airtime, and just about every one of the ride's hills delivers some good sustained floater. From there, you go up into a tight turnaround and right into another airtime hill, which is trimmed, but it doesn't really seem to affect the pacing of the ride. From there, you go up into a left banking upward helix, which in the back gives you a pretty surprising moment of positive G's since the pacing of this element is really good. You glide through the mid-course and go over 2 airtime hills which are each just over 100 feet tall. Then you head into a tight right-hand banking helix and dive into the ride's finale, a splashdown that slows the train in the most theatrical way possible as it heads into the final breaks. From the top of the lift hill to the brake run, Diamondback's duration is about 1 minute and 12 seconds long. Let me start by admitting that Diamondback doesn't really have the most inventive layout. Aside from the splashdown at the end, this is a pretty safe out and back layout from B&M. But there are 2 things that Diamondback does really well that makes it stand out to me, especially compared to other B&M hypers: floater airtime and pacing. Everyone knows that B&M hypercoasters are designed to give good floater airtime, and I think Diamondback delivers sustained floater airtime as well as any B&M hypercoaster out there. If you're sitting towards the back and are able to get some space, you'll be floating out of your seat on just about every hill during the course of this ride. And a lot of this floater has to do with the pacing. Diamondback just seems to go through each of its elements at a faster rate than the average B&M Hyper. Now I will admit that every one of my trips to Kings Island has been in the middle of summer, but every time I come off Diamondback, I'm always really impressed with how well paced it is. And when the ride is running really well, I actually think that it's one of the few B&M hypers capable of giving some instances of ejector, or flowjector if you want to call it that. Many of Diamondback's hills start off with floater at the crest and initial descent, but then halfway down the hill you do get that tug of ejector. Diamondback was the second of the new generation B&M hypers to be built by Cedar Fair, and these hypers feature the new gen trains with a staggered seating arrangement. These trains are longer in length, but still feature the same style seats and clamshell restraints. A lot of people seem to prefer the first generation hyper trains with the 4-across seating, but I have no problem with the style of the second generation trains. If anything, I think the longer trains just make the ride's airtime better in the back rows. You know how there's some coasters that you just seem to like everything about? Diamondback is one of those rides for me. It probably has something to do with the fact that it was a major new addition in the year that I started getting into coasters, but I really do like a lot of things about this ride. I love the snake themed trains. I think the ride has a great name and it fits perfectly into the Rivertown area of the park. I think the splashdown is really cool, the colors are great. Everything about this ride is just so visually appealing. And on top of that, it's just a really solid roller coaster. Now let's finally get to the reason why you probably clicked on this video. In my opinion, Diamondback is still a much better coaster than Orion, Kings Island's new for 2020 B&M Giga, despite the two rides sharing the same model and Orion being taller, faster, and longer. Now I'm not going to spend any time criticizing Orion because first of all, the community has done that enough, and second, I've already given over 10 minutes of my thoughts on Orion in my review video earlier this year. But there's two main reasons why I think Diamondback is the better coaster. The first reason is the length of the rides. While Orion has a longer track length by about 40 feet, Diamondback's ride time from the crest of the lift hill to the final brakes is actually 17 seconds longer. That is a very significant difference in ride time for two coasters that are practically the same length. Now obviously Orion's top speed is 11 miles per hour faster than Diamondback, and therefore it goes through its layout at a much faster pace, but it's also impossible to ignore that Diamondback just feels like a much more complete roller coaster. I think Diamondback having a handful of good elements following the mid-course brake run really helps the ride feel longer, as opposed to Orion, which doesn't even have a mid-course. Also, capping the ride off with a splashdown is a really nice way to give the ride experience a sense of finality. I don't think anyone gets off Diamondback thinking, I wish that was longer. Whereas with Orion, you hit the final brake run really wishing there was another element or two. And if you do an actual tally of each ride's elements, excluding the lift hill and brake runs, Diamondback has 10 elements, while Orion has just 7. The second reason I prefer Diamondback to Orion is because of the airtime. And this one really comes down to my own personal preference. I tend to lean towards preferring coasters that have good airtime rather than ones that are catered towards having great speed. Diamondback's layout is focused on delivering sustained airtime, while Orion's elements emphasize the ride's high speed. Now obviously, this isn't Kings Island's fault. It would have made no sense for them to have designed Orion to be an airtime machine when a coaster of the same exact make and model with an emphasis on airtime exists right across the park. But when it comes down to ride experience, I really like airtime, and Diamondback does airtime pretty damn well, which is why I think it's still the best B&M in the park. Anyways, let's go ahead and throw Diamondback into a tier. I'm going to go ahead and put Diamondback alongside Orion in the great tier. Although Diamondback is probably more towards the middle of this tier, while Orion is a little bit further down. Like I've said, Diamondback is just a really solid coaster that does a lot of things really well. It's got good airtime, a fun layout, a cool theme, and a great finale. Diamondback is right up there at the top of my B&M hyper rankings alongside Goliath at Six Flags Over Georgia. I think the only thing that's lacking from Diamondback is a real wow moment, like an instance of great ejector or forceful positive G's. But I'm still really high on Diamondback, and I think it's a great headlining member of that really impressive Kings Island coaster lineup. That's it for my thoughts on Diamondback. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. As always, thank you guys for checking out the video, and we'll see you all next time.